This is shrinkback, and there are a lot more causes than I think people are aware of. So today we have this 69 Firebird that we're going to be painting. This entire car has been painted and had bodywork on it. And unfortunately, every single panel on this car has shrunk back. And it looks terrible. So I figured, what better of an opportunity to talk about shrinkback other than today? So today we're going to talk about the causes of shrinkback, and we're going to talk about how to avoid shrinkback, because shrinkback doesn't just become an issue when you start laying paint. It's something to consider way before you get that car in the booth. And what you do after you lay your sealer is actually a great example, because if you spray canned blender on the edge of your sealer to smooth the edge out, what you're doing is basically just spraying solvents, and they're not mixed properly with your sealer. You're gonna have way more solvents on the edge of your paint than everywhere else. Ultimately, what you're setting yourself up to do is trap those solvents, which is the direct cause of shrinkback. While I do my spray out, because this car is not an OEM color, and I just got my camera picked up today because I was having an issue with it, so what a great day to not have a camera. I figured, let's talk about what solvents are. You hear the word solvent a lot. I mean, we all do. Do you guys actually know what solvents are? Solvents are what make your paint sprayable. They're your reducer, okay? Your reducer is the most solvent-focused material in your mixing room. Without reducer, you couldn't spray paint out of a gun. You'd be rolling it on the car. The sole purpose of solvents are ultimately to evaporate. When they evaporate, that's what allows your paint to harden or dry. Now, when you trap solvents, what's gonna happen is, over time, they're gonna find their way out, and when they do, your material is going to sink. And that shrinking can take place days or even weeks later. It all has to do with the material you used and how you applied it. And also the environment that you applied it in, because how your material dries is heavily impacted by the area you painted it in. But as I mentioned, shrinkback can be caused way before the car even makes it in the booth. For example, let's say you're doing bodywork and you put a coat of filler on and you see a spot where you know you're gonna need more filler. So rather than wait for your filler to dry and sand it down and then add more filler, you just go ahead and mix more filler and throw it right on top of the filler that's still drying. You're just asking for shrinkback. Now, the same thing applies when you're applying your primer. So let's say you're priming your bodywork and you see a spot that you might want a little more primer. Rather than wait for that coat to flash off, you just go ahead and pick the gun back up and slap some more primer on it. Well, don't be surprised when your bad bodywork eventually shows through the paint. And that's an obvious cause. If you have bad bodywork, eventually your paint will seep in to those cracks and deep scratches that you left behind. Now, let's say that your bodywork was perfect and your application method for your filler and your primer were absolutely spot on. Now you're prepping your bodywork, you're sanding down that primer edge, you're feathering it out, absolutely perfect. Well, guess what? When it comes in the booth, if you apply your paint wrong, or your environment doesn't match the materials that you're using, that absolutely perfect bodywork and absolutely perfect primer edge that you feathered so meticulously will still show if your paint shrinks back. Which is why I know you guys who are shooting canned blender on your sealer edge, which I used to do myself, think that there's not going to be an issue because it looks perfect in the booth. Do you see the car a week later, 2 weeks later, a month later? I guarantee the transition from your sealer to the old paint is going to show. So how do we avoid shrink back? Well, that's what I'm focusing on today, because I do not want to make the shrink back on this car any worse than it already is, because everything looks terrible. The number one thing that you can do to help avoid shrink back or limit shrink back, because you'll always have some shrink back, is to make sure that you have airflow, sufficient airflow going through your painting room or booth, whatever you're in. What airflow does is it will assist the material in letting go of these solvents. In other words, it will encourage the solvents to leave your paint. I'm going to tell you the next best thing you can do to avoid shrink back, but before that, I want to make a suggestion to you guys. Next time you apply your sealer, what I want you to do is wait an additional 10 minutes before you throw your color on. Don't use any canned blender. Don't over reduce your sealer. Don't throw reducer in a separate cup, the same one that you use for your sealer, and shoot that on the edge. Doesn't matter. Don't do that. Just wait 10 extra minutes. Then throw your color on. Let me know how quick that sealer edge disappears. The next best thing that you can do is use the correct speed reducer for the environment that you're spraying in. Now, it's important to use the correct speed hardener as well, but more so reducer, because as I mentioned earlier, your reducer is the most solvent concentrated thing in your mixing room. Now, this is a 3-stage color. At least the color that I picked that was closest to this was a 3-stage color. So we're just throwing on our top coat real quick. Let me actually throw a little more there in case I got any overspray on the quarter. I just want to cover it up. And as I mentioned, this car had shrink back galore. I mean, every single panel was shrinking back and showing imperfections in the bodywork and probably the prep work as well, because there were scratches, there was edge mapping. You could see where the bodywork started and stopped. So what I did to try to help this guy out, because the shrink back wasn't the reason he was here, it was just to get that repaired and to get this repaired, had my prep guys sand this car down, at least any panels we were painting, with 600 and 800 to at least put an effort into leveling all those imperfections out. Now, what I'm doing in the booth to minimize the amount of shrink back that comes back, I'm just making sure that I'm using the correct material that matches my environment, and I'm being very patient. I'm letting everything flash off more than suggested by the manufacturer, and I'm applying my material very sparingly, because the best thing you could do is limit the amount of solvents on the car. That's going to limit the amount of possible shrink back. And that's just one of the reasons you don't pile on filler on a car. Like I said, it all starts with the bodywork. Make sure, for you body guys out there, if any of you are watching this, or the painters that do bodywork, from the second you put your filler on your car, actually, before you even put your filler on the car, when you wipe your car down with Prepsol, make sure that Prepsol is completely flashed off before you start applying your filler. When you're putting on your primer, read your TDS, because it will tell you exactly how much time to leave in between coats. We actually had that problem here. One of the guys who was newer was applying the primer and just globbing it on. Well, I got the car in the booth, and guess what happened? When I put my sealer on, for some reason, my sealer just wouldn't dry, and I was going crazy in here. But once I baked my sealer and it still didn't dry, it was mushy, I knew the problem was under the sealer. Now I'm on my final coat of the pearl here, and then we're gonna be ready to clear this thing up. And I'm not gonna apply my clear how I normally do. I'm gonna use a little bit different of a method. And the reason I'm doing this is, again, to limit the amount of shrink back that shows up after this car gets cleared and baked. Now I know everyone is not lucky enough to have the Ferrari of paint booths, but luckily I do. So here's what we're gonna do. I don't know the exact name for that mode of the booth, but basically what it does is just take in and push out a lot of air. So it increases the amount of airflow going over those panels drastically, which is going to help the solvents escape. By the way, this is the black chrome Apex. Let me know what you guys think. Pretty much a mirror like my paint jobs most of the time, not all the time. Nobody's perfect. If any painter tells you he never gets a run, he never has any issues, he's full of shit. So don't feel bad when you do. All right, we have our clear in our cup over there. I'm just taking our panel temperatures. Right now we're at 82.5. I'm spraying Omni MC161, and I only have the slow hardener, which calls for 80 degrees. Now our panel temperatures are matching our material. Our material, however, is slightly under the ideal 80 degrees, but 77 is close enough. Now, if you're a DIY guy, the best advice I can give you, because you cannot control your environment as well as someone who's in a booth, is use a 4-to-1 clear. Do not use a high solids clear. Obviously, more solids, more solvent, more shrink back. Now we're all set to start laying this down. What I'm gonna do is switch to a voiceover. This way I can explain to you guys the application method that I'm using to aid in limiting the amount of shrink back we'll see after I bake this thing. Took my mic off, but before I forget to mention this, right before you start spraying, start your timer.
There are a few things I'm doing differently than I normally would in hopes of limiting shrink back. Usually I have my fan one turn in on the apex for clear coat on my first and second coat, but in this case I chose to keep it wide open on both coats. A larger fan is going to spread the material out thinly as it meets the air. This is going to do two things. Number one, it will increase atomization, which will help avoid flooding the panel. It's also going to spread our material more evenly across the panel, making it easier to get even coverage. Even coverage will, of course, help prevent us from flooding a spot here or there where we may briefly lose the consistency in our overlap. I also chose to go with the control cap for clear. Normally I prefer the flow cap, but being that the control cap has such a tight center orifice, it was going to deliver smaller, finer droplets, which ultimately are going to cause us to end up with slightly less film build than the flow cap. But in this particular case, that's exactly what we want, especially on the first coat. I also increased my pressure, but only for the first coat. Instead of the normal 28, 29 PSI spray out, I took it up to 32, 33. The reason I did this was basically the same reason I used the control cap. I wanted to ensure I was putting out smaller droplets for the purpose of achieving less build in my clear. And the last thing that I did was increase my distance from the panel. Usually I prefer to be right on top of whatever I'm painting. But because I want to utilize my fan being wide open, I stayed about 2 inches, give or take, further back than usual. Mostly to utilize the entire width of the fan to achieve the most uniform coverage possible. I was debating messing with my speed, but I felt like I would have been trying to change too much in one shot. So these are the things that I changed, and it seemed to work out pretty well.
All right, so I just finished laying that first coat and we're 9 minutes in. Now I want to know how many of you guys would have went back, mixed some more, and then ran straight back in here. I know I would have if I didn't have that timer going. So here's how we're looking. For those who know how I paint, you know, for me, this is a light coat because usually I don't have any dryness going on like this. It's just the first coat. You don't need perfection in one coat. You always want to start light and gradually go heavier. You don't want to trap anything under the coats that follow your first coat. So by applying light at first, you're limiting the amount of solvents that potentially could be trapped, which is great because on our next coat, that's going to allow us to go heavier without running into any issues. So we are at 15 minutes, well, 16 minutes, which is the higher side of what the TDS for the clear that I'm using calls for. It calls for 10 to 15 minutes. So we're right at that 15-minute mark, but I just brought my clear in the booth and it's not up to temperature yet. So I'm gonna give it about 2 or 3 more minutes, let my clear warm up a little bit, and then I'm gonna lay this second coat on and we'll see how it comes out after the bake. I'm gonna bake this thing, then we'll see how it looks. All right, this thing just finished baking and everything looks absolutely beautiful. I mean, there is not a sign of shrinkback. Well, I shouldn't say there's not a sign. I do see a little bit of shrinkback going on, particularly on the hood, which makes sense because it would shrink back the most. It's really hard to see on camera because it's so minor. And just because we don't see any shrink back right now doesn't mean there won't be any shrink back down the line. Although when you bake it, you do decrease the amount of time it will take to shrink back. So what we see is closer to what we'll get when this car fully shrinks back. I'm so tired of saying shrink back. Anyway, that's going to be it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, if you got any value out of it, or if you were entertained, if you could, please consider dropping a like, comment, or maybe even subscribe. Until the next time, no more shrink back. Peace.